Hello everyone, this is Volden, and today we are back in Sagroth, the lair of Vermin, which is the new 6-man that came out with update 35. It's been about a month since my last video, and since then, we've had balance changes, we've had some new tiers come unlocked, and today we had tier 5 open up. And since our strategy has developed a lot and we got a chance today to try it out on the highest difficulty, I thought I'd make a video today explaining in detail the strategy for boss 2 of this instance. I won't be covering any cheesy strategies involving pet taunts or kiting. I think they're less consistent, and it's also nice to learn how the fight can be done legitimately, so to say. As I explain, you'll see footage of us clearing this boss on tier 5, a couple of runs that we did this morning. I'll talk through the fight, and then we'll watch one full run together as I call the play-by-play, explaining what we've seen so far. So without further ado, let's get into it. The first thing that people often want to know about is always the group comp and what works best. Now I'm going to say many different group comps work, even poorly built ones work just fine as long as you have just a few things covered. And the core of the group is going to stay the same as any 6-man. You want a tank, you want a healer, and you want a support class, either a yellow Berg or a yellow LM, and then you're going to want 3 DPS. Otherwise, all you need is some decent corruption removal and some good AoE CC options. Now you won't see this anywhere in this video, but my ideal comp might look something like this. You might have Blue Guardian on tank, and this would let you make the most out of AoE interrupts using Shield Smash in one slot, as well as offering good corruption removal. I'd have Blue Runekeeper on heals. Blue Runekeepers are just really powerful at the moment, and they can keep the group up really well despite really spiky damage coming out. I'd use Yellow Lawmaster for support. They offer great offensive and defensive support, and they can keep both the large rats locked down if you choose to go that way. For the DPS, I would bring a Hunter, a Champion, and a Red Captain, I think. The Hunter brings high single target DPS to burn the boss down, along with some good AoE, as well as a nice AoE daze to throw in if you need it. Champions bring great AoE DPS to keep the tiny rats under control, as well as another great AoE CC option with their Horn Stun. And Red Captain brings some really good DPS as well. They also allow for really strong burn phase using Oathbreakers and other buffs. And finally, they bring an in-combat res in case the Runekeeper or someone without a DNF goes down. Now, as I said, this is just my ideal comp, and I wouldn't say that any class is non-viable in here. All the meta specs work great in this instance, even when not supporting each other perfectly. All you want is some corruption removal and good access to AoE interrupts, and you'll see some variety of comps used throughout the video. Alright, let's get into the fight strategy, and the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to break it into 2 sections. The first thing I'll go through is some of the mechanics that are going to happen constantly throughout the fight, and then I'll go through a play-by-play of the phases that you'll encounter through the fight. And hopefully this will help you get a good understanding of how to get some consistent runs of this instance, and this boss in particular, from tier 5 down. So let's get into the constant mechanics. First up, we've got the tiny vermin, and these are probably the most obvious since they will often be what will end up killing your run, even if you've thought you've done a great job managing everything else throughout the fight. Now, it's also probably the most important mechanic to get right if you want your runs to be consistent. These rats will spawn periodically through the fight in sets of 3, and when they spawn, they will immediately begin inducting, at the end of which they will summon a puddle that will deal a large proportion of your morale as damage if you step inside it. These are particularly dangerous because they can often end up getting stacked on top of each other, so these are best to be avoided through any means necessary. The best way to counter this mechanic is obviously to interrupt those inductions. So to do that, make sure you have enemy names turned on as well as enemy inductions. You can find those 2 settings in your UI options so you have nice and clear indications as to when the tiny vermin are inducting. There are far too many of these to get with your individual interrupts, so you're going to want to use your AoE CC to deal with them. Champ Horn is great for this, but even better is Shield Smash from Guardian tanks. If you play well, you can always have Shield Smash open to you, and what makes it so powerful is that it acts both as an interrupt and as a stun. That means even if the vermin have been stunned recently and are still immune, the interrupt will still work. Now that being said, if you can CC them somehow, you have a few extra seconds after their induction goes off before the puddle spawns, so take advantage of that as well. And finally, if you can't interrupt the skill somehow, Be open in communications and be ready to move out of where the puddles will spawn. You'll see that we are pretty constantly moving to get out of the way of these, and we're moving as a unit. Other than the tiny vermin, all we have to do is manage the abilities that the boss casts itself. First up, we have Infection. Now this uninterruptible skill places an eye over one player in the group, and once the induction goes off, that player will explode, dealing high initial damage as well as a dot to anyone close by. To counter this mechanic, make sure everyone is standing close to the boss within melee range. The boss will only use the ability on someone outside melee range, so if you always stay close, no eyes will occur. Now that being said, there are some reasons why you might need to move away from the boss, and if that is the case, you just need to get far away from the group. Using abilities like Champion's Challenge or Knowledge of Power can help reduce the hit on the player with the eye, but to help yourself, you can maximize your physical mitigations so you take as little damage as possible. Your healer can also help out by placing Morale Bubble on you or by using Sacrifice. Note that there are some places in the arena that you can use to line of sight the ability, making it miss you completely. The next ability the boss does all the time is called Blighted Bite. This will be targeted on a single player that does not have aggro of the boss. It will be a large initial hit and will place a wound on you. When you cleanse the wound, an infectious puddle will drop, acting the same as the tiny vermin puddles. To counter this mechanic, make sure you get healed back up to high health before running out of the group to cleanse your wound, so that no one else gets hit by the puddle dropping. Be aware that you may now get the infection skill targeted at you, since you have moved out of melee range. And finally, the boss will cast its own induction called Tail Swipe. If you allow it to complete, the boss will knock everyone away and deal moderate damage to the group. This is often a death sentence for your run, since it's rare that everyone will be high health enough to live, and people may also get knocked into puddles, further increasing the damage that they take. To counter this mechanic, have someone assigned to get the interrupts on the boss. We usually have used the tank for this job. And those are all the mechanics that you have to deal with continuously throughout the fight. Next up, let's look at some so-called phases, which will help determine what the focus of the group is at any given time, aside from dealing with the mechanics that we've already been over. At the very start of the fight, you'll be burning the boss and dealing with corruptions. When you pull the boss, you may get a little while to bring its health down before corruptions are applied. Take advantage of this and try to get as much damage done as possible while you can. Once the corruptions have been applied, your focus as a group will be to remove them as quickly as possible. The corruption is stacked in many layers, and the more you remove, the more damage you can do to the boss. Associated with this corruption is a stacked wound on the tank. This wound increases the amount of damage the tank takes, but this is not so bad, since there isn't that much damage that the tank takes anyway. It's important to remember to leave at least one stack of the wound on the tank until the end of the fight. If all corruption and wound stacks are removed, the boss will reuse this ability, making you go all the way through this phase again. As you might have noticed from the footage, I don't usually try to even get the wound down very low. It's better to be safe than sorry in this regard. If it does get low, keep open communications so that your group doesn't use any targeted or group-wide cleansers on you. At the 30-second mark, we enter phase 2. 2 larger rats will spawn in the middle of the arena, one ferocious and one robust vermin. These rats each have an induction of their own and do more damage than the tiny vermin. The ferocious vermin will apply a damage buff to the boss, and the robust vermin will heal the boss. You really don't want to let either of these inductions go off, and if either of them do, they often mean the end of your run. Once they spawn, you need to deal with them somehow. You might have your LM lock both of them down permanently, which makes the entire mechanic go away. More commonly, however, we just lock one of the rats down, usually being the ferocious vermin. This means that the robust vermin will need an interrupt when it spawns, usually a ranged one, and then it will run into the group. Keep watching it for interrupts and focus down the robust vermin. Now these usually spawn before you have managed to get all the corruptions off, so once you have killed the rat, return to getting those down as a priority. If you keep at least one of these large rats alive, you will never have to deal with them again. If they are both killed though, they will spawn again, usually leading to a very messy run later on. Once you've dealt with the large rats and you've removed all the corruptions, we enter what I call Phase 3, which will involve the cleansing devices. Now, periodically, the boss will tear up a dot on the party, which deals a % of your morale as damage every so often. This can usually be sustained up to 3 stacks, but if you let it get too high, you will immediately die. Throughout the fight, you will want to use cleansing devices to clear this dot. We like having access to 2 devices throughout the fight, but depending on your DPS, you might only need 1 or maybe 3. For this reason, I recommend that you start the fight in the back right quadrant as seen in the footage. This allows you to use up more space with the tiny vermin puddles, as well as giving you access to the cleansing device here. Be aware that throughout the fight, the boss will make quadrants of the room inaccessible and will disable the cleansing devices inside. The reason we start in the back right is because that is the last quadrant to be disabled at around 40% boss health. This gives you the flexibility to cleanse and move out of there in plenty of time. If the boss isn't dead and the dot is stacking up again, use another cleansing device in the final quadrant. The only thing left to do is simply burn the boss down. If you manage your corruption and wound effect, and you manage the large rats, and you manage cleansing appropriately, there won't be anything else left to do. The constant mechanics will still occur, but once you have those under control, the fight should be very simple indeed. Once the boss reaches 1% morale, it green bars, and all the other rats despawn, ending the fight. So, we've walked through every mechanic in detail. Let's watch one last run of the fight so you can see it all in action as we go through the phases one by one. As we pull the boss here, you'll notice that we don't get corruptions right away, giving our DPS some time to burn the boss down. I establish aggro on the boss and get ready for corruptions to spawn. I also prepare shield smash for the first tiny vermin spawn in case I can interrupt those. Alright, there the corruptions go, and now the group is focused on removing them and moving out of tiny vermin puddles. Soon we will get the large rat spawning, and here it comes. The robust is coming into group, and you can see the group has swapped to focus that rat down instead. It should die fairly quickly, and once it does, they'll move back onto the boss to keep removing corruptions. All this time, we've been managing those tiny vermin and getting interrupts on the boss. Some tiny vermin puddles went down there, and so we just moved out proactively so that we didn't have to take damage from them. We also popped the cleansing device here, and you see everyone dip their toes in just to remove that dot. The corruptions are coming down now, which means the boss is going to start taking more and more damage. We've dealt with the large rats, so we won't have to deal with them again in this run. And as the boss is getting to a lower health percentage, we're getting ready to move out of this quadrant so that we don't get caught in the large puddle that the boss places there. Sometimes you don't need to interrupt the tiny vermin if you're already planning to move. You can just leave them inducting behind you to spawn their puddles out of harm's way. So there we go, Othes has been summoned, and we're just burning the boss down now as we get into our final quadrant. Still managing those tiny vermin, getting Blighted Bite every so often, and maybe the occasional infection. We've popped the second cleansing totem here just to be safe, dipping our toes in so we make sure that dot doesn't get too high. And we've just got about 40 million health left to go on the boss. We're making sure we keep on moving so we don't get hit by those tiny vermin puddles, getting our AoE CC whenever we can. And the boss shouldn't stay alive for too much longer after this. I hope this video has been helpful. If you have any questions about this fight afterwards, please leave them in the comments section down below, and feel free to share this video with anyone that you think might find it helpful. I'm planning on making guides similar to this for each of the bosses of the new raid, so keep your eyes out if you're interested. Thanks for watching, and happy raiding.